Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Interim Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Today we're in the Coita and Donald Barker Gallery at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. My guests are Arlene Keizer and Jessi DiTillio. Keizer is an Associate Professor of English and African American Studies at UC-Irvine. She is the author of Black Subjects, Identity Formation in the Contemporary Narratives of Slavery. Her interests include African American literature and culture, literary and critical theory, feminist theory, and cultural studies. Her current book project analyzes the work of artist Cara Walker as a window into Black postmodernism. DiTillio is an assistant curator of contemporary art at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. She curated the current exhibition, Emancipating the Past, Cara Walker's Tales of Slavery and Power. DiTillio earned her MA in art history at the U of O. Her thesis was titled Perverse Fascination, Medium, Identity, and Performativity in the Art of Cara Walker. Thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Jessi, tell us how this exhibition came about.
So we started discussing it initially when I was in graduate school looking for a thesis topic. I was an intern at the museum at the time and working with Larry Fong, our former senior curator of American art. And we just started talking about contemporary artists that we were interested in, and Cara Walker had been on my mind for a while. And he mentioned that there was a possibility of this show because of the collection of these works in Jordan Schnitzer's collection. He's a collector based in Portland. So that was the beginning, and then we continued to discuss it, and I kind of kept bringing it up randomly at meetings for the next 2 years or so. And then it finally came together, and yeah. Now it exists.
So what led to your interest in Cara Walker's art?
I first encountered her work when I was in college. I was working at PS1 Contemporary Art Center in New York. I went to college in New York and worked at their art bookstore, so would just kind of peruse the shelves for things that stuck out to me. And I encountered her book, My Complement, My Enemy, My Oppressor, My Love, which is just a beautifully bound book, so it kind of leaped off the shelf, and started looking through the work and immediately felt kind of possessed and haunted by it. And as I was looking to figure out what direction I wanted to take my research in as a graduate student, I knew that I wanted to work on a living female artist whose work engaged with politics and identity, and she just kind of became this perfect fit for me.
What media does Walker work in? I mean, we have one piece that we're standing in front of, but tell us a little bit about what the work looks like and what she works in.
Well, her signature form is the silhouette. She takes it into a variety of media, but she initially became famous for working in cut paper silhouettes, which she would burnish to gallery walls with wax. So the works were always kind of site-specific and ephemeral. And by using the silhouette, she was referencing the 19th century, both in the origin of the form and also using it as this sort of visual metaphor to think about stereotype and the way that you can express very complex narratives and stories through this very minimal visual means.
Say a little bit more about the principal themes that her work explores.
Well, she looks at the 19th century and the antebellum period especially, but even though her work is about history, she's always tying it back to identity in the present moment and the way that that period has had this deep and very tormented psychological legacy for relationships between Black and white people today.
Arlene, could you tell us a little bit about the controversy that Walker's work has stirred?
Sure. When Walker came on the art scene, she was a very young artist, and her first work was much like the work you see in this show, and an older generation of African American artists were very scandalized and disturbed by the ways in which she was re-engaging a very painful history. So sort of transforming a historical narrative in a kind of fantastical but obviously deeply disturbing way. So this group of artists really sought to suppress the work because it violates these very powerful taboos against explicitly representing African Americans in sexual situations. So, that's how it began, and that has continued throughout her work.
You've written about Walker's work in the context of a broader cultural trend that you call African American post-memory. Can you tell us about that trend and what you mean by that term, post-memory?
Post-memory, I'm really borrowing from the literature on the Holocaust, the aftermath of the Holocaust. And it's the kind of memory that's passed down to the descendants of survivors of trauma. So what began happening in the 1960s in African American literature was that a group of writers returned to the history of slavery in order to think through the present moment. And that has continued up to today. So their relationship to history I'm describing as post-memorial. So there's a sense of thinking about a historical trauma, but not having directly experienced slavery. And so trying to work through the set of problems that arise from a situation of domination, especially one that persisted for as many years as U.S. slavery did. So both in art and in literature, there was this return to the history of slavery as a kind of ground for thinking about contemporary relations.
So why do you think Walker's visual art has provoked so much more controversy and critical hostility than the related work of writers like Gail Jones and Alice Randall and Octavia Butler? What do you make of that?
Oh, I think that has everything to do with the visual, and I think Jessi may have something to say about this as well. So, I mean, the work of Gail Jones and Alice Walker did actually provoke a lot of controversy, but not as great as this work, partly because it's being exhibited in some of the most significant museum venues, not just in the US, but around the world. And I think it also has to do with reception. So what happens when bodies enter a museum? You've got a mixed group of people looking at this very provoking work. And I think that in itself is part of the charge, the emotional charge of it. Even as we were watching Walker's films yesterday, there was a sense of group discomfort when 100 or more people are watching these very disturbing images on a screen. And I think that has fueled the controversy in ways that a literary text just doesn't. I mean, it's consumed really in private. You can talk about it in public, but it's consumed in private.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Jessi, tell us a little bit about the visual lexicon that Walker uses in her work.
Well, she's often working with these direct references to the materials that people call Black memorabilia or Black Americana. So these very widespread archetypes of images of African Americans that began in slavery and were really widely perpetuated during the Reconstruction era as part of the kind of visual campaign to continue to support the ideology of slavery and to maintain African Americans as an oppressed and discredited class. So you see kind of these exaggerated facial features and things that relate to images from popular culture, like advertising, film, television, but also even just kind of food packaging, like you think of like the Aunt Jemima images or things like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You've mentioned that the work is largely silhouettes. Most of them are black on white gallery walls. Mm-hmm. There's, they evoke this history of stereotypes. How does that strategy, that technique, involve viewers in the meaning making of these works? What happens with viewers when they look at these stark, stereotypical renderings?
Well, because the figures are all rendered in black, it forces the viewer to think about what sorts of factors besides color play into the ways that we read and perceive race. So it kind of recruits the viewer to use the information that they already have and perhaps don't know they have. And I think points to the way we all sort of passively imbibe these stereotype images without even realizing it. Particularly for younger generations who are less exposed to the more kind of blatantly racist historical images, I think it points to the way those archetypes like the mammy, the sambo, all of those have persisted in American culture, but in much more subtle and kind of insidious ways.
So the largest work in the show is a series of prints that occupies 81 feet of the gallery. Tell us the name of that piece and something about that piece. It's just, when you see it, it's just an astonishingly grand, massive work.
Sure. So it's called the Emancipation Approximation. She made it in 1999 to 2000. They're all large-scale silkscreen prints. And they came as a portfolio, but when hung together on the wall, create this long panorama. And the figures kind of move in between the frames of the individual pieces. So it really gives you this sense of a narrative that can be read left to right. And yet, as you start to look a little bit closer at this piece, you see that the narrative is fractured, and it's very difficult to read any sort of coherent story from it, which is something that her work often does. It alludes to the idea of a linear, readable story, and yet always kind of disappoints your expectations with that. And the piece has these recurring images of a swan, which alludes to the myth of Leda and the Swan, in which Zeus took the form of a swan in order to rape a mortal woman that he was infatuated with without his wife finding out about it. So the swan becomes this sort of stand-in for the white master, and looks at the sexual relationship between masters and slaves in this kind of fantastical, mythological, and sort of hysterical fashion.
Hysterical, that's interesting.
And also, I mean, thinking about the swan as a representative of Western culture, so not only the symbol of the master, but the culture as a whole, and the way in which it's being sort of forced into these women's bodies.
And in the images, the swan is usually rendered white. Is that correct? Sometimes?
It varies.
It varies?
Yeah, in the beginning of the print series, the swan is black and then turns to white at the end.
Interesting.
And the colors of the backgrounds in these prints change also, so it starts with white and then moves to this gray that becomes a kind of literal mixing of the black and white characters, I think, in the piece.
Interesting. Say a little bit about she's most well known for these silhouette images. But this is not the only kind of work she's done. She does other kinds of work. Tell us a little bit about the progression of the style or the medium that she uses.
Sure. So she started working almost exclusively in black and white with the silhouette figures, but has always kind of drawn in other modes of working. So there is a really interesting series of kind of journalistic drawings that she did that are very expressive and in watercolor and pencil, called The Brown Follies. And that was a series that was in response to a lot of the criticism of her work and began to address more the issues of what was acceptable for her to represent as a black woman. And then later, she started moving on to film. And so we have one of her films on loop in the exhibition, and showed a few in our special program last night. But for those, she transformed her silhouette image into shadow puppets, and so began to perform more actively by not exactly animating the puppets, but manipulating them as a sort of shadow play on film.
Arlene, last night you gave a talk on the campus called 8 Possible Beginnings, Slavery, Pornography, and Formal Origins, which was focused on Walker's films. Can you give us a sense of the talk's topic and argument, what you said about these films?
Sure, yeah. But before that, what I want to say about Walker is also that she's always done narrative artwork. And so as someone who began my work as a literary critic, that was one of the things that pulled me in, the sense that she's really thinking about written narrative, and the slave narratives in particular, as a kind of written history that she's excavating and transforming. So that's, yeah, I just want to highlight that.
Well, I mean, the films clearly are narrative.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, in their drive. What I was talking about in Walker's films is the sense that she's mining a set of visual vocabularies, including the visual vocabulary of pornography, which in contemporary art is not surprising, but in African American contemporary art is somewhat surprising, to really get us to think about what the legacies that the forms carry with them in themselves.
Why is it common in African American art if it's more common in white American visual art to reference pornography?
Really because of the culture of respectability, especially within African American middle class culture. So the sense that that for conscious Black people, the idea that the culture at large is it has applied a set of stereotypes to Black people is just profoundly important. And the idea of representing Black life as respectable, as sort of not fitting into the set of stereotypes that are expected is really powerful in all sorts of African American cultural, literary and cultural products. So Walker is really breaking a taboo by presenting these images, especially as a woman artist.
Another one of the really striking qualities of the work is the way in which she renders these profoundly serious subjects and images, so the sexual arrangements of antebellum culture, the institution of slavery, racist stereotypes, violence, etc., and in this sometimes irreverent and jokey way. It's not just that she's rendering violence and sexuality, it's that she's doing it in this, you said hysterical, this garish and sometimes comical almost way. How do we make sense of that weird, upsetting doubleness that is evident in the work?
I think that has everything to do with fantasy, right? The sense that she's really trying to describe a fantasy space that's created by these stereotypes. And one of the things I think happens for viewers of Walker's films or the work on the gallery walls is that the viewer becomes implicated by his or her own visceral response to these images. So I think that that's part of the reason that she is showing all of the things that emerge from or are part of sexuality. So humor, pain, enjoyment, perverse enjoyment. So trying to look at a set of things that many people would prefer that she not look at or not force others to look at in a public exhibition. Yeah.
Well, when you say that viewers become implicated in the work, it suggests that it's not just that she's forcing them to look at things they'd rather not look at out there, but she's making them think about things that they'd rather not look at in there.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
So much of the work is concerned with the conjunction of sexuality and domination during slavery. As a contemporary artist, why is she so concerned with that history? Why is that so important today?
Well, I think there are two things going on. I think one, she really is thinking about the residue of that history and the fact that it has not really been laid to rest. Yeah, so there are many, I mean, I think it's very easy to press on certain points within those issues and get an enormous response, precisely because it hasn't been worked through or laid to rest. But I think she's also using the history of slavery as a ground for thinking about the present. And I think that's what almost all of these writers and artists are doing in using slavery. So they're really trying to talk about the present through the idiom of the past.
I know in the controversy that surrounds her work, and especially at the beginning of it, there was accusations that she was sort of complicit in stereotyping, complicit in racism. Say a little bit about how it is that the work can provoke that kind of response. That is to say, I mean, what should African American art do if not this kind of thing?
Well, there are lots of other things that it can and does do. I think that the question of complicity and coercion, or the interlocking, the ways that complicity and coercion interlock with one another, is the subject of the work. Mm-hmm. So the sense that in terms of thinking about what resistance to domination, especially to white supremacy, either in the past or in the present, the idea of resistance is obviously the ways that most African Americans want to think about their relationship, our relationship to domination. The problem is that relationships of domination, especially over a long period of time, produce a whole set of responses, and resistance is just one of them. So what I think Walker is trying to do is to think about all of the things that emerge from relations of domination. So if we think now about contemporary ideas like Stockholm Syndrome, we understand that a dominated person may come to believe some of the same things that the dominator believes. And so I think Walker is trying to get us to think through that, and to think, even for a resistant person, what are the ways in which the dominant culture nevertheless makes its way into the psyche.
Mm-hmm. She sometimes refers to herself in the work as the Negress. What do we make of that? What's her intention in casting herself in that role?
She's created this persona that I think does a whole set of things, and I think that one of the problems in the critique of Walker is that she's often been conflated with that persona. Mm-hmm. I think Cara Walker, artist, and the Negress are very clearly separate entities, and she's using that persona to do all sorts of work.
Can I jump on
that
too?
Yeah, it's your turn. Go ahead.
So I've been thinking about this question a lot, and I think that the Negress persona is almost like a piece of performance art that she's doing, and functions as this sort of counterpart to the visual work, in that it helps her to kind of assess the way that these issues bleed between the page and the person, the author, making them. And she's very interested in that question of artistic authorship and the kind of perspective behind looking at these histories.
I want to ask you a little bit more about that performative quality. Are there other ways in which that performative commitment comes out, rather in addition to this figure of the Negress that she plays?
Well, it's definitely very clear in the films, because as she's using these puppets, she makes it very apparent that her hands are manipulating them, and you sometimes see little bits of her face, and often her voice appears. So she's being very conscious about performing the story rather than letting the characters kind of take their own life, and having the illusion of an animated film where the characters seem to be moving on her own. She always is foregrounding her position as the one in control of the story.
Say a little bit more about that. I'm really interested in the implications of that, not just in control of the story, but manipulating the bodies that are in the story, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's kind of taking control of all the characters of all races, which I think is important. She is not just the black female characters, but she's also the white male characters, and she's both victim and victimizer, and kind of messily involved in the whole perverse narrative. maybe.
Yeah. I also wanted to add that, I mean, her choosing the title negress for this persona is, I mean, that word is a historical artifact. If you look in the dictionary at negress, Jewess, they're words that people don't use anymore, especially because they conflate gender with race, right? Those things are tied together within the word in a way that we now understand to be objectionable. And so the word itself is carrying this very charged history.
Jessi, tell us a little bit about the patron response to the exhibit.
It's been really positive. We have some comment books, so we've been able to read what people are thinking as they move through the exhibit, and people for the most part are speak of being profoundly emotionally affected by the work. And I think she's an artist where it's so important to see them in person because the scale is very huge, and when you're standing in physical proximity to a piece of Walker's art, you're forced to kind of engage with it on this almost bodily level. I mean, we can see in this piece behind us, it has this overwhelming quality that is really important to what she's doing.
We saw 3 films last night accompanying Arlene's talk, and I've seen some of her films before. I've never seen them on that large of a screen, and the experience of the overwhelmingness of these narratives it was extremely powerful. And Arlene, you even mentioned that you've seen these films many times.
Yeah.
What was it like for you last night watching them?
It's very shocking. I mean, their effect is magnified by that size. Yeah, and also the sense that you realize that you're watching with a large group of other people, and that is what magnifies the discomfort of watching.
I did want to ask you a little bit about that. I was marveling at your ability to talk about these incredibly difficult subjects in front of a room of 200 people. Do you do this a lot? Do you have this conversation often?
Oh, I do a lot of teaching, so I'm used to that part. But yeah, I've been thinking about this work and writing about it for a really long time, and I think that has everything to do with managing the sort of emotional qualities of it. And I was struck by the fact too that so many people were quiet in response to the work. I mean, I could feel people trying to figure out what was going on and how to respond, how to even ask a question about what they were seeing.
Well, that's a good place for us to stop. Thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I've been speaking with Arlene Keizer, Associate Professor of English and African American Studies at UC-Irvine, and Jessi DiTillio, Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. Emancipating the Past, Cara Walker's Tales of Slavery and Power is on view at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art through April 6, 2014. Thanks for watching.